The United States is quite a weird country when you think about it. It's a collection of 50 states, all with different cultures and economies. Individually, some of them are more valuable than entire countries. For example, California is wealthier than the United Kingdom, Texas is wealthier than Canada, and Illinois is wealthier than the Netherlands. And yet, all these countries find themselves under one united banner, willingly too. Well, almost willingly. See, in a country of over 330 million people, there's obviously a number of people who've tried both reducing the number of states in the Union via secession and even adding to it with proposed creations of new states, especially now more than ever. These movements, though, raise some major questions. What does it mean to be a nation in an era when identities and interests clash within borders? And could independence really solve these regions' problems, or just make them worse? So let's unpack the secessionist movements that are, at least for now, still kind of ongoing, and check out how feasible they really are, and what could happen if the impossible happened and they did actually gain independence. The Hawaii Sovereignty Movement. This is a 700-acre, $100 million property bought by Mark Zuckerberg in 2014, nestled on the island of Kauai. It includes lush farmlands and access to the secluded Pila'a Beach. But this sprawling estate became a sprawling controversy in 2016 when Zuckerberg, through a shell company, initiated lawsuits to force local families to sell ancestral lands. See, these parcels, known as kuleana, had been passed down through generations since the 19th century. Critics called Zuckerberg the face of neocolonialism and made him the poster child of a painful pattern of wealthy newcomers coming in and displacing native Hawaiians. The legal battles intensified calls for stronger land protections, fueling the ongoing sovereignty movement. The movement is called the Hawaiian Sovereignty Movement, and it's been around for a while. In 1893, a US-backed coup toppled Queen Liliuokalani, the last monarch of Hawaii. American sugar barons orchestrated the overthrow, aided by US Marines, with ambitions to annex the islands. But the Hawaiian people fought back. Nearly 38,000 individuals, 95% of the native Hawaiian population, signed the Ku'i petitions opposing annexation. This effort delayed US plans, but then the Spanish-American War happened and US priorities shifted. By 1898, Hawaii was annexed as a US territory, its monarchy erased, its lands seized. Native Hawaiians were left to fight for recognition in their own homeland. Decades later, the sovereignty movement made a comeback, fueled by the cultural revival of something called the Second Hawaiian Renaissance, and protests like the occupation of Kaho'olaui. Kaho'olaui is a sacred island for native Hawaiians, but the US military was using it as a bombing range. In the 70s, members of the Second Hawaiian Renaissance tried to occupy the site, but were ultimately unsuccessful. Finally, in 1990, the test range was shuttered, but the island is still littered with unexploded ordnance after haphazard cleanups. Situations like Kaho'olaui have led supporters of Hawaii's sovereignty movement to question why the islands are under US control, particularly when Hawaii has a history as an independent nation and a track record of being exploited since it became a US territory and then a US state. Today, that question burns hotter than ever, literally. In August 2023, wildfires tore through Lahaina, killing at least 97 people and displacing over 10,000. Activists say that the fire is a warning about Hawaii's future under US capitalism. Real estate developers quickly moved in, offering cash for scorched properties, while native leaders scrambled to protect ancestral lands. Hawaii's resources are increasingly under threat. Streams once diverted for plantations now fuel battles over water rights. The tourism industry, bringing over 9 million visitors and $20 billion annually, has driven housing costs sky high. Now, native Hawaiians make up only around 10% of the population. Sovereignty, activists argue, could empower Hawaiians to reclaim control, implementing laws like Tahiti's restrictions on foreign property ownership, which basically made it illegal for non-residents to buy property in the island nation, like Zuckerberg did in Hawaii back in 2014. The ruins of Lahaina are quite symbolic and represent crossroads. Does Hawaii remain a tourist haven shaped by outside interests, or can the sovereignty movement secure a self-sustaining future for the next generations? Texas secession. Texas has never been shy about its independent streak. Once a sovereign nation for 9 years before joining the United States in 1845, its mythology as a whole other country has lingered in its identity. Secessionist talk isn't new here. From the 1861 vote to join the Confederacy to modern movements like the Texas Nationalist Movement, or TNM for short, Texas has flirted with the idea of going at it alone for a long time. Legally, though, the situation is clear. The US Supreme Court's 1869 Texas v. White decision held that unilateral secession is unconstitutional. Still, movements like TNM argue for a referendum to reassert Texas's independence, claiming the federal government has broken its compact with the state. Polls show mixed support, with about 33% of Texans favoring secession, but 39% opposed as of early 2024. But what would an independent Texas look like? Proponents envision a nation built on oil wealth, a thriving tech sector, and Texan grit. But even its fiercest advocates struggle with the logistics. See, Texas receives $12 billion in federal infrastructure funding annually, alongside billions for healthcare through Medicare and Medicaid. Secession would sever these lifelines, leaving a gaping hole in the budget. What's more, losing US military protection could expose the state's massive border to yet more instability, while also disrupting the state's heavy reliance on interstate trade. For secessionists, it's more about values though. Governor Greg Abbott's hardline stances on immigration and federal overreach feed into the narrative that Washington no longer represents Texan priorities. Recent confrontations, like Abbott's razor-wire border policies defying federal rulings, have amplified this kind of rhetoric. Meanwhile, TNM leaders push policies to make Texas function independently, from currency systems to border management, to prepare for a hypothetical split. There's also the Texas Independence Referendum Act. The act isn't exactly a new idea. It's the latest iteration of a decades-long effort to put Texas secession on the ballot. It was introduced in 2023 by disgraced former Representative Brian Slayton and proposed a statewide vote asking Texans whether the state should reassert its status as an independent nation. Slayton described it as a response to decades of continuous abuse of our rights and liberties by the federal government. You see, these bills often arrive alongside movements of national polarization, tapping into the Texan sense of self-determination and its legacy as a former independent republic. There have been some earlier versions, but this bill was a little different, as it attempted to formalize a post-referendum process, envisioning a committee to explore Texas's own military, currency, and trade agreements. Yet the hurdles remain as insurmountable as ever. The 1869 Supreme Court ruling in Texas v. White reaffirmed the Constitution's stance. Unilateral secession is illegal. And beyond legality, Texas's $300 billion annual contribution to the US GDP would be difficult to disentangle from the federal economy. Unsurprisingly, the act died in committee. Secession may never happen, but its rise in political discourse speaks to a broader question. How far will Texas go to assert its identity in an increasingly polarized nation? Cascadia. Cascadia isn't a country, but it has a flag. This is the Doug flag, 3 horizontal stripes of blue, white, and green marked with a solitary Douglas fir, is flown at soccer games, climate protests, and sometimes outside homes from Portland to Vancouver. To its supporters, Cascadia represents more than a stretch of geography. It's an ethos, a belief that the Pacific Northwest, with its pristine rivers and dense forests, is fundamentally distinct from the political systems governing it. Cascadia, they argue, with its population of potentially 17 million, could thrive as an independent nation, defined by ecological stewardship and local autonomy rather than the decisions of far-off capitals like Washington, D.C. or Ottawa. The vision isn't entirely new. Ernest Callenbach's 1975 novel Ecotopia imagined a breakaway region from Northern California to British Columbia, built on renewable energy, urban density, and community-first governance. Decades later, the idea surged back into relevance. After Trump's election in 2016, Cascadia, now a non-profit advocating for bioregional unity, sold out of its Doug flags overnight. Interest in the movement has spiked for sure, but not really as a serious attempt at secession. Instead, it's more of a cultural statement, a way to differentiate the Pacific Northwest from a nation its residents felt has taken a sharp political turn. But what would an independent Cascadia look like? Economically, it might thrive, with a combined GDP exceeding $1.1 trillion and access to ports and renewable energy. Cascadia could rank among the top 20 economies globally. Yet the challenges loom large. Divisions between urban centers like Seattle and rural areas in eastern Washington highlight how environmental goals often clash with agricultural or logging interests. These internal tensions would likely magnify under self-rule, where local concerns might struggle against regional priorities. And then there's the question of infrastructure. Cascadia depends heavily on federal funding for transportation and public works. Independence would mean renegotiating trade routes, navigating cross-border water rights, and replacing US military installations with regional defense forces. Critics argue that such logistics, coupled with the complexities of operating as a transnational entity, could overwhelm even the most dedicated idealists. Let's talk about those military installations for a minute. The area that would become Cascadia has a ton of them. Across Washington and Oregon alone, there are several strategically significant bases. There's Joint Base Lewis McChord near Tacoma, one of the largest military installations in the United States, and Naval Base Kitsap, home to nuclear submarines and the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. There's also Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, which provides critical aviation support, and Portland's Air National Guard Base, both of which are also key to the region's military presence. If Cascadia tried for independence, these installations would pose an enormous challenge. For one, they're deeply integrated into the US defense infrastructure, supporting operations across the Pacific. Replacing them with a Cascadian defense force would be next to impossible without astronomical costs. Maintaining nuclear submarines, that's a logistical and financial non-starter for a fledgling nation. The expertise, funding, and infrastructure required to handle even conventional forces are beyond the scope of what Cascadia could realistically achieve on its own. The fallout could be surreal. Without US military protection, Cascadia might have to negotiate treaties with both the United States and Canada to secure its borders and access to shared waterways. Given its strategic position in the Pacific, it could become a geopolitical battleground, tempting power plays from larger nations. Cascadia might attempt a civilian-run coast guard to patrol its waterways, but even this would be an uphill battle. The region could also seek international support, but aligning with foreign powers risks alienating its neighbors. Alternatively, Cascadia might abandon traditional military defenses altogether, embracing neutrality like Costa Rica. While idealistic, such a stance would leave the region utterly reliant on diplomatic ties to prevent exploitation by larger global players. Chicago secession, Illinois two-state solution. In Illinois, the growing rift between Chicago and its rural neighbors means that this isn't a question of seceding from the US, but rather of creating another state. Across Illinois, 28 counties have passed non-binding referendums in favor of exploring secession from Cook County, home to Chicago. The sentiment is quite clear. Downstate residents feel drowned out by the city's overwhelming influence, where Chicago and its metro area accounts for 2/3 of Illinois' population. Rural Illinoisans argue that state policies are designed for Chicago's needs, not theirs. Advocates for secession envision a new Illinois, where the politics would reflect small-town values. State Rep. Brad Halbrook has been a key figure in the movement, and he once compared the grievances of rural Illinois to the Declaration of Independence, releasing a weekly list of issues modeled after those levied against King George III. But what would happen if Illinois split in two? Economically, it could be a disaster for the rural counties pushing for independence. According to a study from Southern Illinois University, these counties currently receive an average of $1.70 in state spending for every dollar they contribute in taxes. Cook County, by contrast, loses money, with residents receiving only 90 cents per dollar they contribute in taxes. In Chicago's suburbs, it's even less, with residents receiving only 53 cents of funding for every dollar contributed. Without Chicago's tax base, New Illinois would face fiscal shortfalls, with cuts to services like healthcare and education almost inevitable. For Chicago, the split might not be so bad. Freed from the demands of rural areas, the city could redirect funds toward its infrastructure and higher education systems, potentially creating a more prosperous urban state. But politically, the division would rock the US Congress. A newly conservative-leaning New Illinois could add 2 Republican senators, tilting the balance of power at the federal level. Still though, in 2018, a secessionist movement called New Illinois was cooked up to declare downstate independence from Chicago's Cook County. The movement has actually picked up some steam, and it's now probably the most active secessionist movement in the US. In November 2024, voters in 7 Illinois counties, including Madison, Calhoun, and Perry, approved measures to explore secession from Cook County and Chicago. This brings the total to over 28 counties participating in the growing movement. Madison County, the largest participant so far with a population of 265,000, is the first suburban county to join. Advocates say the split would restore power to rural areas, whose values they believe are dismissed by a legislature catering to urban priorities. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker dismissed the movement as unconstitutional. He pointed to legal barriers like the U.S. Constitution's admission clause, which requires state and congressional approval. Critics argue that secession would just deepen economic inequality rather than really fix anything. You see, these downstate regions that want to secede depend on the very tax revenues they claim are being misallocated. Yes, California. Now let's move west. Thanks to the San Andreas Fault, California might be separate from the continental United States in about 50 million years. But some want to separate California a lot sooner. California's economy is larger than that of France, and its growing secessionist movement suggests it may no longer feel like a part of the United States. The Yes California campaign has built a case for independence, pointing to the state's $4 trillion GDP and global cultural influence. Proponents argue that California could thrive as its own nation, free to implement progressive policies on climate, healthcare, and immigration without interference from Washington. The campaign emphasizes that the state contributes $70 billion more in federal taxes than it receives, money that could fund local priorities like education, infrastructure, and green energy. But life in an independent California wouldn't be that simple, obviously. Trade agreements would need renegotiation, and tariffs on goods entering the US could drive up costs. California produces nearly half of America's fruits, nuts, and vegetables, yet independence would likely mean higher grocery prices within its borders. Imported food and goods, including electronics from Asia, could face added taxes, further inflating costs. And while we're on the topic of trade, this is America's busiest port, the Port of Los Angeles. And right next to it is America's second busiest port, the Port of Long Beach. Together, they form the San Pedro Bay Port Complex, which handles an incredible 40% of all inbound container ship cargo for the entirety of the United States. Independence would immediately change the legal and logistical framework of the Port of Los Angeles. Goods moving between California and the US would no longer be classified as domestic trade. Instead, they'd be subject to customs checks and tariffs and trade restrictions, all of which would significantly increase shipping costs and processing times. For trans-Pacific trade, California would need to negotiate its own agreements with trading partners like China, Japan, and South Korea. Without such agreements, exporters and importers might face World Trade Organization default tariffs, which could range anywhere from 5 to 25% depending on the goods. This would disrupt the seamless flow of goods and make California less competitive as a gateway to the US. US businesses relying on imports from Asia also might start rerouting cargo to other major ports, like the Port of Houston or the Port of New York and New Jersey, to avoid the added costs and delays of processing through an independent California. This would reduce the volume of shipments through Los Angeles, impacting its revenue and the regional economy, while presumably costing the US a lot more. To top it off, the Port of Los Angeles supports over 500,000 jobs in Southern California and contributes $276 billion annually to the regional economy. Reduced trade volume or higher tariffs could lead to job losses in industries ranging from logistics to retail. Goods like electronics, machinery, and apparel, all part of the port's operations, could become more expensive for California consumers and drive up the cost of living. Politically, an independent California might resemble Europe's Nordic states, with universal healthcare and ambitious environmental goals. However, the state's staggering wealth gap could still be a problem, and it could take time to realize the social programs characteristic of Scandinavian countries. Whether the state could truly balance its ambitions with its disparities remains an open question. State of Jefferson. In the wild, northern reaches of California, the idea of the state of Jefferson has been around for a while, both as a political protest and a cultural identity. Jefferson was first proposed back in 1941 by a guy named Gilbert Gable, the mayor of Port Orford, Oregon. It was conceived as a rural escape from the perceived neglect of distant state capitals, which we're seeing now is almost the main idea behind all these movements. Its original Declaration of Independence even included armed locals blocking roads, handing out pamphlets demanding more representation. But just after it started, the attack on Pearl Harbor buried the movement under the patriotism of World War II. The movement was reborn in 2013, when Siskiyou County voted to secede from California. with Modoc and a few other counties quickly joining in. Jefferson's symbolic green flag, marked by a gold pan and 2 black X's that represent the region's double crossing by Sacramento, was waving once again. Advocates argued that the rural counties, spanning a fifth of California's land but housing just 3% of its population, were ignored in policy debates dominated by urban centers like Los Angeles and San Francisco. But could Jefferson sustain itself as the 51st state? The proposed territory, including parts of southern Oregon, would have a population of around 1.7 million, making it the 39th most populous state. Its economy, driven by timber, agriculture, and some tourism, would face serious challenges. Federal subsidies currently prop up services in these areas, and without the tax base of California's wealthier regions, Jefferson would likely struggle to maintain its infrastructure. It's no surprise that the movement has linked itself to the Greater Idaho Initiative, which wants to absorb these counties into a more ideologically aligned state. And finally, Greater Idaho. In eastern Oregon, frustration with liberal policies has ignited a movement to redraw the state map. The Greater Idaho Initiative envisions shifting the border to include 15 Oregon counties, roughly 65% of the state's landmass, but only 9% of its population, into Idaho. Supporters, led by Mike McCarter of the Move Oregon's Border for a Greater Idaho group, argue that rural counties are politically and culturally aligned with Idaho, a state dominated by conservative values. The proposal has gained significant momentum. As of 2024, 13 counties have passed ballot measures supporting negotiations to join Idaho. Backers highlight potential benefits for Idaho, including expanded access to natural resources like timber, minerals, and water. They also cite ideological harmony, since Eastern Oregon leans heavily conservative. But the hurdles are enormous. Under the US Constitution, the move requires approval from 2 state legislatures, Oregon and Idaho, Congress, and the President. Financially, the plan poses some significant risks. Eastern Oregon's economy relies on declining industries like timber and agriculture, offering little to offset Idaho's existing budget challenges, of which there are a few. First of all, Idaho already struggles to maintain its existing roadways and transportation infrastructure. The state has one of the lowest gas taxes in the US, which limits funding for road maintenance and construction. The Idaho Department of Transportation's budget often faces heated debates in the legislature, with delays in approving necessary funding. If Idaho were to incorporate Eastern Oregon, it would inherit hundreds of miles of rural roads and require significant investment in upkeep. Then there's the healthcare. Healthcare in Idaho is underfunded, particularly in rural areas. The state has one of the lowest physician-to-population ratios in the country. Incorporating Eastern Oregon, where healthcare facilities are already limited, would stretch resources even further, making it harder for both Idaho's existing population and its new residents to access care. There's also education. Idaho ranks near the bottom nationally for per-student education funding. In the 2022-23 fiscal year, Idaho spent approximately $8,419 per student, compared to the national average of $13,494. Adding Eastern Oregon school districts, which include Eastern Oregon University and 3 community colleges, would require additional funding that Idaho may not be able to provide. And then they'd have to figure out what to do about the minimum wage. In Oregon, it's $14.20. In Idaho, it's a measly $7.25. For residents of Eastern Oregon, life under Idaho law would bring a plethora of changes. Critics argue that the move could deepen rural isolation rather than solve systematic grievances. Yet for its supporters, the dream of Greater Idaho is less about logistics and more about escaping what they see as political neglect. Secession in the modern United States faces almost insurmountable legal and political barriers. The US Constitution's Article 4, Section 3, requires approval from state legislatures and Congress to alter state boundaries or form new states, creating a gauntlet for movements like Greater Idaho or the state of Jefferson. Even successful historical examples, like West Virginia's creation in 1863, happened under quite extraordinary circumstances: a civil war and a president who was willing to bend constitutional norms. Today's secessionists don't have that kind of leverage, yet anyway. Economically, independence often reveals cracks beneath the rhetoric. California, with its $4 trillion GDP, could theoretically thrive, but disentangling federal-state agreements would strain even its massive economy. Smaller movements like Illinois' downstate push or Greater Idaho, which are actually pretty active, face steeper odds. More broadly, these movements point to a growing fracture in American governance. They're less about geography and more about ideology wars, rural versus urban, conservative versus liberal. Whether they're legitimate cries for representation or symbolic protests, a deeper question underlies all of this. In an era of polarization, can one nation still meet the needs of such widely different communities? Or are these secession movements more like warning signs of a system stretched too far? Thank you for watching.